Well, hello. It's chapter 9 right now, and as you probably saw in the preview, and you may have already glanced at the book to see, chapter 9 is all about relationships. I mentioned in earlier notes that some of it might not directly relate to you, and that's one of the reasons I don't put as much emphasis on this, because we all have different types of relationships depending upon where we are in life. And even though the chapter does not talk about it directly in this way, most of this content is most applicable in romantic relationships. And again, not everyone has one currently, has had one, wants one, and that's fair. But what I want to do is just really talk about a couple of models of relationships that are mentioned in chapter 9 in a little bit different way than how it's presented by the authors in the text, just so it makes more sense, and also we recognize how it can apply to relationships that might not be romantic in relationship. I think we're going to easily see the connections when it is a romantic relationship that we're considering, but thinking about what else we can apply these two models to. But before we get to those two models, I will point out that, relationships are generally something that humans desire. And the first part of the chapter talks about the reasons why we actually choose to form relationships. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that it's good for us, it's healthy, and there are benefits. And a lot of things are valid in there. I like to, instead of just understand what might be the reason for a relationship, to think about why it is that relationships might not continue to have the same purpose as always. So instead of just looking at the origin story, more or less, always reevaluate and reassess. I think it's something that's healthy for you, and it can help you completely change your conceptualization as to what is the current nature of your relationships and how does that affect the communication that happens in it. So, again, those why we form relationship things are interesting and important, and I think the language that the authors use to provide it is really intuitive, so hopefully it makes sense without any additional explanation, because I'm not going to focus on that right now. But what else can we do with that information? But the two types of models for relationships, I like these two ways of just trying to think about and explain relationships a little bit differently. And they're two very distinct ways that scholars have tried to actually plot out, create a diagram, and sometimes even visuals to explain what's going on when we talk about relationships. Maybe I'm more visual than I realize. I don't think I always am. Words generally seem to align with my way of thinking instead, so it's more about verbal, but I recognize at times there's a visual that can really enhance how well I understand something. So thinking about the two models of relational dynamics, the first one is called the developmental theory. And this is a really, really interesting way to actually see a relationship and think about how in any relationship, when it's brand new, through its whole lifespan, it goes through different stages. And basically all relationships can have these steps. We don't necessarily follow them in a sequence or go in order, and it's not just one direction. Bad reference. We don't just follow the same path constantly. We can go back and forth within this relationship. But if you look and think of the very beginning of a relationship where you've initiated contact for the first time, you can see within the developmental model that there are literally, steps that we can go up. And through the act of self-disclosure, through building trust, sharing more information, getting to know each other better, we actually get to think about the nature of the relationship, and we could put different labels on it and identify what stage our relationship is in. And as we draw closer and closer together, get higher up on this particular model, we can choose to actually have a more concrete relationship that has very specific meaning, not only to us, but is recognized differently by other people. Essentially, what does it mean to be a couple? That's what the developmental model is really looking at. And once you've become a couple, how do you maintain it? What does it look like? What are those stages? And you can see there's circles that overimpose the steps that will point out that instead of the new relationship developing, at the top you have relational maintenance. And when you are in that stage, that means that you have created and developed the relationship, and these stages all represent the things that you do to continue in the relationship. The right-hand side of the model, where the steps go down instead of continue up, is essentially relationship disintegration. Not all relationships last. And what you see within this model is what it looks like to have a relationship dissolve, essentially. It doesn't have to end, however. That's one of the things I want to point out within this model. You can change directions through very deliberate effort. Frequently, communication is what has to happen to get the relationship into a different stage, but you can actively work to not be in the stage that you are in. It happens when you are on the left side of the model, when it's a new relationship and you decide whether or not you want to intensify it and actually become a couple. And it can happen on the other side when you recognize that the relationship has some issues. You are coming apart and you and the other person choose not to. So I recognize that lots of the language that I use when I'm talking about the relational dynamics of relationships within the developmental model really is couple based. And I think that's one of the limits within communication. We have relied on traditional perspectives of relationships a lot, and the language that we have within our text, and I was just echoing it now, really is going back looking at dyadic relationships. And the more I live, I'll just say it that way, and the friends that I develop who are in relationships, the more I have learned that we have fewer and fewer traditional relationships out there, and the communication models and language doesn't always keep up with what relationships look like. At least in my world, the people immediately around me. I have lots of friends who actually aren't in dyadic relationships. You think of like poly relationships, triadic or triad relationships, or even open relationships. I don't know if this says something about just my friends and the people that I choose to be with a lot, but we don't necessarily have convention driving what we understand about relationships. And I think this is a bigger issue of what do we perceive a romantic relationship to be. And for the very, very longest time, and within the development of all of these models, the perception was, and the assumption was, and the organization was two people. That's what it meant to be in a relationship. Organizationally, we think two people, and that is not necessarily the case. And I always look for ways where this applies to other relationship models as well. It gets trickier when it's more than two people, but I think there's a utility that can be found if we really actively look and be honest about the nature of relationships. So again, that's the developmental perspective, one of the two really, really important models in this chapter. Again, anytime you're in a relationship, it can be helpful and useful to recognize where you are within the developmental model, because you have conversations and the communication drives whether you stay in that same place within the model or if you move another direction, whether it's reaching a more formal and bonded relationship or if it's the coming apart. So this chapter is all about relationships, but we can look for ways that communication is really an essential part of that. So the second model that I think is really, really great, and this one applies to even more relationships. It's not just the romantic relationships, and certainly not the dyadic only sort of relationships, but it's called the dialectical perspective. This one doesn't have an image in the book, and I have tried a number of years to try to develop a model, a visual of this myself. Still haven't gotten it, so I can't provide that for you, and I apologize. But within the dialectical perspective, it's based on what we do call dialectics, which are essentially two opposing forces that are almost opposite of each other that create conflict. And we have this internally and within the relationship. So it's happening at two different levels. With dialectical tensions, one of the big things that we constantly have is this desire for openness and privacy in our relationship. They're opposite ideas, and what we want any given day might be different than what happens any other day. So you can almost think of it as a spectrum. If you have privacy on one side, openness on one side, you have all this area in the middle. You could say like 1 through 5. Where are you on the scale? Are you right in the middle? You want the exact same amount of openness and the exact same amount of privacy? Are you feeling like you want more privacy this week? Or are you feeling particularly open this week? We have these tensions and we want different things. We do it individually and we do it within relationships. How does the other person or do the other people in the relationship feel? And how do you actually navigate the daily goings on a relationship when one person wants a lot of privacy and the other one wants a lot of openness? That's where the challenge is. And the useful element of this model is recognizing when you're experiencing conflict or you don't feel that your needs are being met within a relationship. Can you identify what the problem is? Is it one of these dialectical tensions? That's where this can become a tool to really help move through some issues and have a different approach to what the conflict might be. So again, that first dialectical tension is that between openness and privacy. And you'll see that there are two other dialectical tensions as well.